The Heron shuddered as the impact reverberated through its hull, a violent reminder that humanity's odds of survival were growing slimmer by the minute. Captain Elara Danvers gripped the command console, eyes fixed on the battle unfolding outside the bridge windows. The Asleel fleet, an armada of invincible warships, loomed over them like a shadow, cold and inevitable. "Incoming fire, Captain," Lieutenant Rian Pierce's voice broke through the static. "They're targeting our shields again. Hull integrity down to 27%. Elara's lips tightened, the situation growing direr by the second. A quick glance at the tactical display showed the Asleel flagship's monstrous silhouette, its energy weapon locking onto their position with terrifying precision. The rest of the fleet was fanning out, the relentless barrage of plasma fire painting streaks of orange and blue across the dark void. "We've been cornered," Elara muttered under her breath. But she couldn't afford to succumb to panic. Not now. Not after everything. "We won't make it out of this unless we do something drastic," Pierce continued, his voice strained but resolute. "The Asleel think we're already done for." A bitter chuckle escaped Elara's lips. "Let them think that. They always do." Behind her, the rest of the crew worked tirelessly at their stations. Every face was a mask of grim determination, yet there was an unmistakable undercurrent of fear. The Heron, a relic from an era long past, had never been intended for this kind of fight. It was a symbol of humanity's stubborn refusal to accept defeat, patched together with duct tape and desperation. The comms crackled with the cold, metallic voice of General Khoris, the leader of the Asleel forces. "You cannot escape. You will be wiped from the stars like all the other insignificant races that dared challenge us." Elara's fingers hovered over the console, her mind whirling. The Asleel had underestimated humanity at every turn, believing their technological supremacy would crush them with ease. They didn't know it yet, but the humans were about to play a hand the Asleel would never see coming. "Prepare the secondary systems," Elara ordered, her tone a sharp contrast to the anxiety bubbling beneath the surface. "Activate the core relay. Pierce, get me the tactical readout of their flagship's weaponry. I need a way to buy us time." "You got it." Pierce's fingers flew over his console, eyes darting back and forth between the readouts. "The flagship's energy weapon is designed to decimate entire fleets. But there's a weakness." "A weakness?" Elara's heart quickened. "Speak plainly." "It's reliant on an unstable power core," Pierce explained, his voice growing more urgent. "If we hit it at the right angle, it could overload, maybe even disable the flagship." Elara nodded, formulating a plan in an instant. It was a gamble. The chances of hitting such a precise target from the Heron's damaged state were astronomical, but it was the only option they had left. "Set course for the flagship," Elara commanded. "Full throttle. Aim for their power core. Let's make them regret underestimating us." Pierce's eyes widened. "Captain, that's suicidal." "We don't have time for caution, Lieutenant," she shot back, her voice firm, unyielding. "Do it. Now." As the crew scrambled to execute her orders, Elara stood tall, watching the steady stream of Asleel fire rip through the darkness. She could feel the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. This was no longer about just her crew, or even Earth. This was about proving that humanity would never go quietly into the dark. The Heron lurched forward, its aging engines straining as they fought to push the ship toward the Asleel flagship. Elara's breath was steady, though her pulse hammered in her ears. It was all or nothing now. "Almost there," Pierce said, his voice thick with tension. "We're on target." Elara's eyes narrowed. "Lock onto that core. Prepare to fire on my mark." The seconds stretched into eternity as the distance closed between the two ships. The Asleel flagship loomed larger and larger on their screens, its intimidating bulk now a deadly focus for the crew of the Heron. Suddenly, the ship rocked violently as another barrage of plasma fire hit them directly. Alarms screamed across the bridge as shields flickered dangerously low. Elara's heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was the moment where everything either came together or fell apart. "Target locked," Pierce announced, his voice full of reluctant hope. Fire, Elara commanded. The ship jolted as the auxiliary weapons fired, sending the concentrated blast of energy streaking toward the Asleel flagship's power core. Time seemed to slow. Elara held her breath. For a moment, nothing happened. The Heron was an island in the chaos of war, trapped between an unstoppable force and a last, desperate chance. Then, a blinding flash. The flagship's energy weapons sputtered and sparked. The core had detonated. But the danger wasn't over. General Korak's furious voice crackled through the comms once more. This isn't over, humans. You've only delayed the inevitable. Elara's gaze remained fixed on the display. The flagship was crippled, but the battle was far from won. You're wrong, Korak, she muttered under her breath, a fierce smile tugging at her lips. This is just the beginning. The Heron lurched forward, its battered hull groaning under the strain of acceleration. Elara Danvers stood at the helm, gripping the controls tightly, feeling the pulse of her ship as if it were an extension of her own heartbeat. The battle outside the windows had taken a sharp turn, but the Asleel weren't done yet. Their flagship, though severely damaged, was still alive, its weapon systems powering up for another round. Elara glanced at Lieutenant Pierce, his brow furrowed as he analyzed the flickering tactical display. He'd been with her since the beginning, back when this war seemed like an impossible nightmare. He was one of the few who hadn't given up on the idea that humanity could still fight back, even against an enemy like the Asleel. And now, as the seconds ticked down to their inevitable confrontation, Elara was starting to believe it too. We've got one shot at this, Pierce said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet tension. Their flagship's power core is critically unstable, but if we hit it again, we might finally put them down for good. But if we miss, well, I don't need to tell you how bad that'll be. Elara's jaw clenched, her eyes never leaving the screen. The Heron was barely holding together, and their next strike had to be precise. But the Asleel weren't about to let that happen easily. Their fleet had adapted, and they'd be ready for any move the humans made. Get ready to fire the secondary relays, Elara ordered, her voice cutting through the tension on the bridge. And Pierce, I want that flagship disabled. No room for mistakes this time. Aye, Captain, Pierce replied, his fingers flying over the console, each keystroke a calculated risk. The silence in the room was thick, punctuated only by the hum of the ship's failing engines and the distant rumble of plasma fire. It was a strange sensation for Elara. She wasn't scared, not exactly. But the weight of what was coming pressed down on her, tightening her chest with every passing moment. The last time they'd attacked the flagship, they'd been lucky. A precise hit had cracked the Asleel's outer defenses, but it wasn't enough to bring it down. Now, they were taking aim at the heart of their enemy's power. The gamble felt reckless, but Elara had learned long ago that sometimes, the only way to survive was to throw everything you had at the problem. Captain, Pierce said suddenly, his voice sharper, the Asleel fleet is repositioning. They're setting up for another strike. They're going to try to crush us between their forces. Elara's fingers tightened on the armrest, her pulse quickening. She could see it on the tactical map. The Asleel ships were closing in from all sides, their coordinated movements as precise as any well-oiled machine. They were confident they had this in the bag. But there was one thing they didn't account for: humans didn't fight by the same rules. Activate the evasive maneuvers, Elara snapped. We'll need to keep them off balance while we get into range. And keep an eye on the flagship, it's the key to this fight. She didn't need to say it twice. The crew was already moving, executing her orders with the precision they'd practiced time and time again. As the ship veered sharply to the left, Elara's gaze lingered on the Asleel flagship, its hulking silhouette now surrounded by the smaller, more agile warships of the enemy fleet. Despite the odds, Elara didn't falter. They couldn't afford to. Not with everything on the line. The Heron rocked again, this time from a distant blast, but it held steady. Every fiber of the ship screamed in protest, but Elara knew the crew's resolve was just as strong. They wouldn't let it fall. Not while she was in command. We've almost got an opening, Pierce reported, his voice tight with concentration. 5 seconds until we're in range. Elara nodded. Ready the main weapons. This is it. The ship accelerated once more, barreling toward the Asleel flagship, its guns trained on the target. The seconds stretched long, each one feeling like a lifetime. Elara's heart beat louder in her ears as they closed in. She could see the flash of plasma fire from the enemy fleet, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was this final strike. Firing, Pierce said, his voice low but full of intent. The blast streaked across the void, a brilliant beam of energy that collided with the Asleel flagship's power core with a violent explosion. For a moment, there was silence, an eerie, breathless pause that felt like the universe itself was holding its breath. Then, the flagship trembled, its massive hull vibrating as energy cascaded out of control. The Asleel's fleet faltered, their formation thrown into chaos. The flagship's once gleaming surface was now marred with fractures, the heart of the warship exposed and vulnerable. Elara exhaled slowly, but there was no time to relax. Keep up the pressure. They're still a threat. We can't give them a chance to recover. The battle raged on, but the Asleel were reeling, their grip on the fight slipping. They had underestimated humanity before, and now, the taste of victory was within reach. Captain, Pierce said, his voice shaking with disbelief. We did it. They're pulling back. The flagship's core is completely destabilized. Elara's eyes narrowed, the faintest flicker of a smile crossing her face. Not yet, Lieutenant. The war isn't over. But the humans had made a powerful statement today. And for the first time, the Asleel were starting to realize something they'd never considered before: humanity wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. The aftermath of the battle felt oddly quiet, the air thick with the hum of the Heron's strained engines. Captain Elara Danvers stood alone in the command center, staring at the cracked viewports where the last remnants of the Asleel fleet receded into the dark expanse. The flagship had been crippled, its once proud form now a glowing wreck on the edge of the void. The rest of the enemy forces had scattered, unsure how to proceed after their calculated defeat. But Elara knew better than to let her guard down. Victory had never come easily, and it wasn't going to start now. Captain, Lieutenant Pierce's voice broke through her reverie. We've received a transmission from the Alliance. They've detected a massive surge of Asleel reinforcements en route. They're sending everything they've got. Elara's stomach churned. The last thing they needed was more enemy ships descending on their position. They had mere hours, maybe minutes, before the next wave arrived. Their resources were already stretched thin, and the Heron was in no condition to fight another battle of this magnitude. Where are the reinforcements coming from? She asked, her voice calm despite the rising tide of panic she could feel bubbling beneath her skin. Pierce ran his fingers over the console, glancing up at her. They're coming from the Khoris Nebula, Captain. That's a jump point deep within Asleel territory. We didn't expect them to move so quickly. They've adapted faster than we anticipated. Elara clenched her fists, eyes narrowing. They weren't just facing an enemy of brute strength, they were up against a species that learned and adapted in real time, evolving their tactics with frightening speed. Humanity's advantage in ingenuity had always been their hope, but against the Asleel, even that was starting to feel like a futile weapon. We can't outrun them. Not with this ship, Elara muttered to herself. She turned sharply toward Pierce. Do we have any new intel on their reinforcements? Any weaknesses? Pierce hesitated before speaking. There's a pattern in their deployments. They prefer to use smaller ships in groups to overwhelm their targets. But if we can isolate their flagship, we might be able to disrupt their command structure. If we target their communications node, then we take out their leadership and cause chaos in their ranks. Elara finished for him, a spark of determination flaring in her chest. It was risky, but it was the best shot they had. And they weren't about to back down now. A low rumble vibrated through the deck, signaling another plasma strike. The Heron shuddered violently, the crew grimacing with every hit. A fresh wave of Asleel fire had begun to rain down on them. Elara's jaw clenched. The Asleel weren't waiting, they were already moving in for the kill. We're sitting ducks unless we act fast, she said, her eyes flitting to the tactical map. A new cluster of enemy ships was forming on the screen, converging on their position. "Captain, their fleet is gathering in formation," Pierce said, eyes wide with urgency. "They're setting up for a major strike. This isn't just an attack anymore, it's a purge." The words hit Elara like a slap. The Asleel weren't just trying to win, they were trying to wipe humanity off the map, once and for all. There was no negotiating, no mercy. If they didn't do something now, they would never have another chance. "Set course for the Nebula," Elara said, her voice filled with a cold resolve. "We'll ambush them before they can regroup." "Captain, that's a suicide mission," Pierce protested, his voice cracking with disbelief. "The Nebula's full of dangerous anomalies. The ship can't handle the stress." Elara turned to face him, her expression hard. "If we don't take the fight to them, we won't survive the next wave. We've already come too far to back down now." "Understood," Pierce said, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't agree with her, but he knew better than to argue. Elara's will was ironclad, and he'd seen her pull off the impossible more than once. "All hands, prepare for evasive maneuvers," Elara ordered. "Engage the hyperdrive as soon as we reach the edge of the nebula. I want us to hit them hard and fast, before they realize what we're doing." The tension in the air was palpable as the crew scrambled to ready the ship. Elara felt the familiar, terrifying rush of adrenaline as she prepared to lead them into the unknown. Every instinct screamed at her to turn away, to find a safer route, but she refused. She had already lost too much to turn back now. "Captain," Pierce called again, his voice softer this time, "are you sure about this?" Elara's eyes locked onto his, her gaze unwavering. "We don't have a choice. We fight, or we die." The Heron plunged toward the nebula, the stars around them blurring into streaks of light. The massive gas clouds loomed ahead, hiding deadly currents and magnetic fields that could tear a ship apart. But Elara didn't hesitate. She trusted the crew, trusted the gamble she was about to take. They weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting to prove that humanity could face the impossible and win. Behind her, the crew worked together, a seamless unit, preparing for the battle that would decide their fate. The nebula waited, and with it, humanity's final chance at victory. But as the Heron neared the edge of the chaos, Elara couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The Heron shuddered violently as it plunged into the heart of the Khoris Nebula. The ship's hull groaned under the strain of the magnetic fields, the lights flickering and dimming. Elara gripped the armrests of her seat, her knuckles pale from the pressure, eyes fixed on the forward screen, which was nothing more than a swirl of dense gas and erratic energy pulses. There was no turning back now. "Captain," Pierce's voice crackled through the comms, thick with urgency. "The enemy fleet is right behind us. They're closing in faster than we anticipated. We don't have much time to set up." Elara's pulse quickened. Every instinct told her to run, to avoid the storm they were heading straight into, but her mind overruled the fear. They had to engage. The Asleel had pushed them to this brink, and now humanity had the chance to strike back, not just for survival, but for a future. "Prepare the weapons," she commanded, her voice steady, but her mind racing. "We need to make them pay for every second they've taken from us. If we can disrupt their command, it's over. They'll scatter like cockroaches." Pierce hesitated, then acknowledged her orders. "Aye, Captain." As the ship lurched through the unstable currents of the nebula, Elara scanned the tactical display, her mind calculating angles, estimating distances. It wasn't perfect, but they had no choice. The nebula's anomalies would mask their approach, just enough to give them the edge they needed. But as they neared the heart of the enemy formation, Elara's stomach dropped. The Asleel fleet had adjusted their strategy. They were no longer just chasing. They were hunting. "Captain, they're locking onto us," Pierce shouted. "They've activated their interceptors." Elara swore under her breath. The Asleel weren't just reacting anymore, they were anticipating their every move. The whole point of entering the nebula was to hide their position, but now it felt like the enemy was reading their every thought. "Initiate evasive maneuvers." Elara barked, her eyes flicking to the helm. We need to get closer, but we can't afford to get hit. Do not let them lock onto us. The Heron groaned as the engines roared into life, maneuvering through the thick cloud of gas, narrowly dodging an incoming barrage of plasma. Elara's heart raced, the pounding in her chest matching the rhythm of the ship's desperate attempts to escape. Pierce, how's the targeting system? She asked, her voice tight with anticipation. It's almost there, Captain, Pierce replied, sweat dripping down his forehead as his fingers flew over the console. But we can't hold them off much longer. They're too fast. We're not going to get another shot like this. Elara stared at the screen, eyes narrowing. Her mind raced, she needed a miracle. And then it came to her. We don't need to hold them off, she said, her voice cutting through the tension. We need to make them come to us. Increase our speed. Push us toward the flagship's blind spot. We'll give them a target they can't resist. Pierce blinked, confused for a moment. Captain, if we do that, we're practically asking to be destroyed. We're going to gamble everything, Pierce, Elara said, her eyes locked on his. They think they've got us cornered. We need them to believe that. With a sharp nod, Pierce hesitated for only a moment before executing the orders. The ship lurched forward with unnatural speed, diving into a gap between the enemy forces, forcing the Asleel to track them with all their firepower. The plan was risky, but Elara was betting everything on the hope that they could force the enemy to split their forces. As they approached the flagship's rear flank, Elara's breath caught in her throat. The flagship was massive, a towering structure of blackened steel, and in its shadow, the smaller ships moved like ants. They were close enough now for the final strike. Ready the main weapons, Elara ordered, voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity. We need this one shot to count. Seconds ticked by. The targeting system locked onto the flagship's exposed reactor core. She could feel the pressure in her bones, the crew, the whole of humanity, was depending on them. Pierce's hands hovered over the controls. Captain, he said, his voice low, we're locked on. But if we miss this, we're finished. Do it, Elara commanded. Fire everything. The ship erupted in a burst of energy as the main cannon fired. A brilliant beam of light tore through the nebula's cloud, slamming into the flagship's power core with a deafening explosion. For a brief moment, everything was silent, as if the universe had paused to witness the destruction. Then the flagship shook violently, its core destabilizing. The Asleel fleet seemed to falter, their formation breaking apart in a chaotic frenzy. Sparks flew from the Heron's console as the ship groaned under the strain, but Elara couldn't tear her eyes away from the screen. The flagship's lights flickered, and it began to crumble, the energy cascading outward in all directions. Yes! Pierce exclaimed, his voice cracking with disbelief. It's working. The flagship's going critical. But Elara wasn't finished yet. Her fingers were already moving, inputting the final sequence. This isn't over, she said, her voice a low growl. We finish this now. The final volley hit the Asleel ships, their ranks splintering as their command was lost. The remaining forces scattered, unable to regroup under the weight of the Heron's relentless assault. The battlefield, once a graveyard of ships, was now a testament to humanity's defiance. Elara sank back into her chair, exhaustion setting in, but the satisfaction of victory was like a fire in her chest. They had done the impossible. Against all odds, they had struck the Asleel down. The war wasn't over, but it was a turning point. And humanity had just shown the universe that it wasn't ready to fall. Pierce, Elara said, her voice calm but filled with pride. We won. Pierce nodded, a grin spreading across his face. We did, Captain. We really did. And for the first time, Elara believed that maybe, just maybe, they were going to win this war after all.